Israel saw Hamas as a threat, but a manageable threat, something it could live with. And what's changed after October 7th is Israel no longer sees Hamas that way. It sees it as an intolerable threat on its border.
Yesterday's peace summit in Cairo failed to reach any sort of agreement about how to de-escalate the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. A perhaps unsurprising outcome, given that three of the key players, Israel, the US and Iran, were not there. At a post-conference speech by King Abdullah II of Jordan was particularly damning. He said, "The message the Arab world is hearing is loud and clear. Palestinian lives matter less than Israeli ones. The application of international law is optional, and human rights have boundaries. They stop at borders, they stop at races, and they stop at religions." So the big question remains unanswered. Where do we go from here? We can speak now to Gregg Carlstrom, the Economist's Middle East correspondent, who's in Jerusalem. Good afternoon, Greg.
Afternoon.
Just tell us about this peace summit. What do you think it achieved?
I think there were some very eloquent speeches that, in the grand scheme of things, are meaningless. I mean, as you say, I think it was unsurprising, not just that three of the key players weren't there, but, you look at what this conference set out to achieve. It had two goals. One of them was to try and achieve de-escalation in Gaza. The other was to try and rejuvenate the peace process, put talks about a two-state solution back on the map. Not only did it fail to achieve that, they couldn't even agree on a joint statement at the end of the conference, as these sorts of things usually do. And I think that just reflects, first, the gulf between European and Western countries when it comes to the events of the past 2 weeks in Israel and Gaza. And then also, again, as you say, the fact that the key player, really, America, wasn't there or was represented at an extremely low level. Whether or not this continues, it's really a decision for the Israeli government to make. And the only country that can meaningfully exert pressure on the Israeli government is America, and they've made it clear that, at least in public, they have no desire to do that.
I mean, you say that. Do you not think that Joe Biden was quite clever with his language this week? Because he stated before he arrived in Israel that he absolutely supported Israel's right to defend itself, as he's been saying all along. He also said he wanted to see Hamas removed, really, as a force in Gaza. But then on arrival, he used the language of grief and his own experience of grief to just caution Israel about not to be consumed by rage and to not repeat some of the mistakes he says America made after 9/11. And given that, I was speaking to a journalist also in Israel earlier who said that actually all this talk of an imminent ground invasion may be premature. Maybe the ground invasion may be pushed back in part because of those warnings from President Biden. Do you put anything in that?
Right. I think that is the American approach. When you speak to American officials, they say it's public embrace of Israel, but privately there's an effort to try and put some pressure on the Israeli government. And what Biden is trying to do is exactly what he did 2 years ago when there was a much shorter Gaza war in 2021. He supported Israel in public. Privately, he kept escalating the pressure on the Israeli government, and eventually he was able to push them to a ceasefire. I think the difference this time is that the Israeli view of Hamas has changed so much over the past 2 years. In every previous round of conflict between Israel and Gaza, there was a sense that both sides would eventually get to a point where they could go back to the status quo. Israel saw Hamas as a threat, but a manageable threat, something it could live with. And what's changed after October 7th is Israel no longer sees Hamas that way. It sees it as an intolerable threat on its border, something that both the Israeli security establishment and political elite, but also the Israeli public, feel they can't live with. And so I think the idea of trying to privately nudge them towards a truce, it's much harder this time because the objectives of this campaign are so much wider ranging than in any past war in Gaza.
Do you sense, though, Greg, a shift in military strategy from the Israelis? Perhaps they are considering just delaying any ground invasion whilst they wait to see the effectiveness of these airstrikes. And of course, we had more airstrikes on Gaza overnight.
I think it's likely to be slower than anyone expected. I mean, you remember in the days after the Hamas massacre on October 7th, when the Israeli army called up 360,000 reservists and sent tanks and other equipment down to the southern border. And I think everyone was sort of braced at that point for what seemed like it would be a very large, all at once, ground invasion. And I think not only have they slowed the pace down a little bit, but they're also looking to do it perhaps in stages where, rather than sending huge numbers of troops across the border, they send smaller numbers. They sort of go neighborhood to neighborhood or town to town in Gaza. I think there still is eventually going to be a substantial ground campaign, but it might be slower and smaller in the early days than we expected it to be.
Just want to ask you, Greg, about America wanting the UK government to name the IRGC as a terror group. Of course, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a branch of the Iranian military. Do you think that's likely? Do you think the UK will do that?
I think I mean, this is such a perennial debate when it comes to not just the IRGC, but all of these groups around the region. I think in the past, the argument that the UK has made, that other European governments has made, the argument has always been two things. One is that these are state actors. This is a group that is part of the Iranian state, part of the Iranian armed forces. And also that if you impose sanctions on these groups, that you essentially just push them further underground, push their operations overseas further underground. I think both of those arguments might be a little harder to maintain at this point, but what the UK is going to do, I'm not sure.